Hi everybody. I just wanted to take a minute to let you know that in your parents' emails there are some math things for you to work on. I'm going to send out some spelling things tomorrow or on Friday, and then I'm going to keep doing my Ribsy read alouds, so we have that stuff to work on. When we last left off in the Ribsy read aloud, Ribsy had kept going back into that elementary school. So when we think about that, I guess we have to think about which trait that shows that Ribsy has. So I would want you to think about, does that show that Ribsy is determined, or does that show that Ribsy is patient, or do you think that that shows that Ribsy is stubborn? You could think about each of those traits, and then you could think about what he's done to get back into the school. That would be your evidence for that. All right, so let's catch up with Ribsy. We are on page, we are on page 100 and we're on page 105. Ribsy had just gone back into the classroom, and that little girl, Penny, raised her hand to say the dog was back. "Keep quiet," whispered the boys. Mrs. Sonchek merely said, "The dog is not bothering anyone, Penny, so pay no attention to him." Mrs. Sonchek did not like to waste her classroom time. Boy, do I understand that. There were so many interesting and important things to learn in the second grade. That was how Ribsy became a member of a second grade class. He spent his nights in garages whose owners had left the doors open. In the morning, he went to school with the neighborhood children, who fed him bits of their lunches and, in a day or two, began to bring him an occasional dog biscuit. When he was thirsty, he had only to go to the drinking fountain in the schoolyard, and someone always turned it on for him. After he had managed to lap the spurting water with his tongue, the boy usually, or the girl, had a drink too. Following the flag salute, when he was sure of being petted if he stood up, he dozed all morning, going out at recess with the rest of his class. At lunchtime, he got in a line and went to the cafeteria, where he finished the sandwiches of those who asked him to. And here's the illustration that goes with that. Imagine what Mrs. G would say if a dog was in the line. I think she'd probably give the dog some food. Ribsy would sniff and politely refused if he didn't like the lunch. Peanut butter stuck to his teeth. After lunch, he lay at the back of the room with his nose on his paws, waiting for school to be out so he could play with anyone who wanted to play with a friendly dog. It was a pleasant life. This had gone on for several days. Then, one day at lunchtime, Ribsy lined up as usual and went to the cafeteria. He was very well behaved, stayed with his class, and sat down beside a table where Mrs. Sonchek's bagged lunchers were eating lunch while the rest of the class lined up to buy their lunches. Interesting that Ribsy actually makes smart choices, too. He was licking the remains of a crunched-up potato chip from the floor when he became aware of a man who was standing over him. "And who is our friend?" asked Mr. Woody, the principal. "A nice dog," said Penny. Ribsy was pleased when the principal stopped to pet him. "And whose dog is he?" asked Mr. Woody. "I'm not sure," said Pete. "He comes to school every day. He must live around here someplace. See, he has a collar." He pointed to the red collar that Mrs. Frawley had bought for Ribsy. Boy, I wish it was the part where we knew that Ribsy had Henry's collar, because that would have solved a lot of these problems. Instead, that collar was taken off. "I know," said Mr. Woody. "I've seen him. Perhaps he belongs to someone who's already at work all day. From that fancy red collar, I would guess he might belong to a lady." "Oh, please let him stay," begged Penny. "He's an awfully good dog. He even stands up for the Pledge of Allegiance." Mrs. Sonchek's bagged lunchers all nodded. Ribsy wanted to please this man, so he held up his left paw. Mr. Woody smiled and shook hands. "Well, fellow, I see you're a southpaw." Ribsy, always glad of attention, stood up and wagged his tail. "It looks as if Mrs. Sonchek's room has a mascot," said Mr. Woody, "as long as he behaves himself." Mrs. Sonchek's bagged lunchers beamed at the principal. "Our mascot is always good," they said. I'm going to pause here so we can think about what we know about Ribsy from other stories. If we think about what we read in Henry and Ribsy, we should probably have the thought in our head right now that it's going to be difficult for Ribsy to behave. Not because he's a bad dog, but because he's the kind of dog that trouble always seems to find. He typically gets in trouble. Think of this sandwich issue with the police officer. Think of falling out of the boat when they finally got to go salmon fishing together. So the principal says Ribsy can stay as long as he behaves. Let's see what happens. The week went smoothly until Friday arrived. As soon as I read that detail, I start to think to myself, something's going to happen. And if we were in the classroom, I know you'd all be going, right at this moment. Friday in Mrs. Sonchek's room was show and tell. It started like any other day. Mrs. Sonchek looked around the class and noted that Danny was absent. Ribsy stood up with the rest of the class for the flag salute and then flopped back down for a nap. Does anyone have anything to share with the class this morning? She asked. Kathleen came to the front of the room to show off her doll, which had a pair of real little sunglasses. Pete showed a tool chest that he had for his birthday. He said his mother would not let him use the hammer or saw in the house. Some of the kids looked interested. Some of them did not. Philip had just finished telling him about the time he was riding down a hill with his father and the brakes of their car refused to work. When the door of the classroom opened, Danny came in with his mother, who was carrying a sheet of corrugated cardboard and a wooden box with holes put into the sides. It was a rule in Mrs. Sonchek's room that anyone who brought in a pet for show and tell had to bring a parent too. The parent's job was to take the pet home. That's a smart teacher idea. I'm sorry we're late, Mrs. Sonchek, said Danny's mom, who looked as if she had not taken enough time to get ready this morning because she was rushed. Danny insisted on bringing in his squirrel for show and tell. I know also, as soon as we read that, you'd all be going, Ribsy in the classroom, and now a squirrel. The cage was too big for Danny to carry on his own, so I had to stop and put some holes in this box to make it work. All the boys thought this was funny. They were sure that this was going to be a very, very exciting show and tell. The rest of the class was excited too. They were going to get to see a real live squirrel right there in school. My squirrel is gnawing on the box. Danny's eyes were bright with excitement. A lively squirrel, exclaimed Mrs. Sonchek, smiling bravely. But can we see it inside the box? Danny said the aquarium was empty, and we could put Frisky in it with the cardboard over the top, Danny's mother said, looking quite apologetic, reminding Mrs. Sonchek that this was not her idea. It was Danny's. Yes, said Danny enthusiastically. Frisky will look really nice in the aquarium. The class was delighted. A squirrel in an aquarium? All right, Danny. Mrs. Sonchek gave her permission. I'm sorry to take up so much classroom time, apologized Danny's mother as she put the wooden box down inside the aquarium. Now, Danny, hold the cardboard over the top and clap it down quickly when I take my hands out. She slid back the lid of the box. Ribsy, who had opened one eye when he heard the murmurs of excitement from the children, caught a whiff of squirrel. He did not even stop to think. He automatically jumped to his feet, barking. Startled, Danny's mom gave a little scream and jumped far away from the aquarium. She didn't know Ribsy was there. Danny dropped the cardboard. A gray squirrel with a bushy tail darted out of the box and sprang up onto the edge of the aquarium. Ribsy put his paws on the counter and barked furiously. That squirrel did not belong in here, chattered the squirrel, and ran along the counter below the windows with Ribsy following on the floor. The class laughed and shouted. Catch him, cried Danny's mom. A boy grabbed Ribsy by the collar. Ribsy pawed at the air with his front feet and strained as hard as he could, with his collar choking him. Mrs. Sonchek cleared her throat. Class, she cried. Class, please. How could any class be quiet with a squirrel loose in the room? Nothing that interesting had happened since Billy had brought in a live clam. Frisky jumped to the top of a pile of readers in the front of the room, and from there he took a flying leap to the staff that supported the flag in the bracket above the blackboard. Here's an illustration that goes with this. I cannot imagine that happening in our classroom. I would not like to have a squirrel in there. Now, normally, I would stop us at exactly this spot, but I'm not going to do that today. Ribsy broke loose and ran under the flag. He put his paws in the chalk tray and made so much noise. He would show that squirrel who belonged in this room and who didn't. Frisky ran lightly to the end of the staff that held the flag and scolded back at Ribsy. This infuriated Ribsy, but delighted the class. If this kept up, there would be no time at all for math. "Boys and girls," cried Mrs. Sonchek, banging on her desk, "please, please." Then the door opened, and Mr. Woody, the principal, entered, followed by Mrs. Hildenbrand, the school nurse. At the sight of the principal, the class became a little quieter. Not much, but a little. "I'm terribly sorry," said Danny's mom. "I didn't mean to take up so much classroom time." Mr. Woody frowned at the class. "Quiet," he ordered. "What is going on in here?" This time, the class obeyed. But Ribsy did not. Neither did Frisky, who flitted his tail and scolded. Mr. Woody gasped at the situation. "Someone get the dog," said the principal. 3 boys ran to the front of the room. One tackled Ribsy, and the other 2 grabbed his collar. "Mrs. Sonchek, get me a jacket," directed the principal. "Here, take mine." Danny pulled off his jacket and handed it to Mr. Woody. Ribsy, straining at his collar, panted hoarsely. These boys were spoiling his fun. "Quiet, everyone," repeated the principal. He walked to the front of the room and stepped up on one of the chairs in the reading circle. "Now, Mrs. Sonchek, when I lift the flag down, you throw the jacket over the squirrel." Ribsy made strangling noises while the boys tried to hold him back. The class waited breathlessly to see if the principal's plan would work. This was way better than a live clam. Slowly, the principal reached for the flag, and slowly he lifted it from its bracket above the blackboard. The squirrel stopped chattering. Slowly, slowly, the principal lowered the staff. Never had Ribsy wanted to leap at anything as much as he wanted to leap at that squirrel. Slowly, slowly, Mrs. Sonchek lifted Danny's jacket. Scolded the squirrel. Ribsy, who would accept anything from people, even a bubble bath and a little straw hat and spectacles, resented the sassiness of this squirrel. So he growled. Frisky leaped from the flagstaff. Mrs. Sonchek tried to throw the jacket over him, but it fell empty to the floor while Frisky ran lightly along the chalk tray, hopped to the floor, and ran under the teacher's desk. Mrs. Sonchek picked up the jacket and prepared to try again, while Danny's mom and the nurse took jackets from the coat room and prepared to stalk that angry squirrel. Mr. Woody replaced the flag in its bracket and armed himself for the chase with a yardstick that Mrs. Sonchek kept on the chalk tray as a pointer. When some of the boys started from the cloakroom to get their jackets, Mr. Woody said sternly, "In your seats, please. There is enough people running around already." We're going to pause right here because it's the perfect cliffhanger. We don't know if they're going to catch that squirrel. We don't know the other events that are going to happen, but I want you to think about what might happen. I also want you to think about what Mr. Woody said when he said that Ribsy could stay as long as he was good. Is he being good? Or is this one of those situations that Ribsy always ends up in? He's not bad. He's just in a bad situation. Have a great night.